Thank you for that great introduction, and for the University of Wisconsin-Madison for hosting us. I also want to add that we are both affiliate scholars as a part of the newly founded Center for Psychedelic Drug Research and Education at The Ohio State University. You want to say something?
Oh, just that this is as Luke mentioned, a small segment of a very broad research program that both Paige and I have been involved in for many years. So I've been working publicly in the field since 2010, and for a very long time on your part as well. We've been around since before the influx of capital in the space and have been kind of tracking the shifting discourses as money has started to influence the sorts of ideas that are circulating.
Yeah, on that note, I've taught about half a dozen courses on cannabis, and so we have a model for the corporatization of previously scheduled drugs, which is ongoing, and we expect to see that model refined as it moves into the psychedelic space. That's not the entirety of this talk. Obviously, this talk deals with issues of ideology and politics. I want to sort of provide a brief disclaimer or content warning, whatever you want to call it. What you're looking at here is not an image that we made up, for the purposes of this talk. This is LSD blotter that presumably was used and circulated with a politician and a swastika in the middle of it. There are several other right-wing psychedelic memes that are interspersed throughout this talk. They were either sent to us or found in the wild. I just wanted to emphasize that we're not cooking things up. We're pointing to that which is happening.
And there will be as well some reference to anti-trans and other forms of hate speech. So just be forewarned in advance.
Yes. So this is a great opportunity for us in that, we had to actually put together a talk for a paper that we were invited by Frontier Psychology in a special issue on psychedelics and sociality to write on something we had previously independently written about, issues of ideology and its intersection with psychedelics, ideas of hierarchical orientation and consciousness expansion or exploration. This paper was published last fall, and just to toot our own horns for 1 second, has gotten significant engagement in that, according to the Frontiers metrics, has been viewed more than 96% of all other Frontiers articles published by that outlet. So clearly something about this topic is got some broad appeal.
Timely.
Yeah. So there's a lot of eyes on psychedelics, as I think we're all aware. There's this thing called the Psychedelic Renaissance going on, which a part of that is the process of mainstreaming psychedelic culture and use and experiments and science. Just to give an idea of what we'll be talking about here, we'll just sort of outline the reasons for this work and go through some basic terms, just so that we're all on the same page. In discussing earlier iterations and components of this work, I think we encountered that there is a lack of a common lexicon, and so we wanted to make sure that everybody understands that we're using certain terms in a particular way, and that those ways are backed up by the historical and peer-reviewed definitions of what those are. We've got section, and then we just sort of borrowed the section titles from the paper. So just to give an idea of what is coming. So by way of introduction, there was work published in the that was peer reviewed in scientific literature about psychedelics and shifts in political perspective, personality traits, first published by Noor and colleagues in 2017, with a respectable survey sample. So, you know, shy of 1,000 people were included in this work. And there was a follow-up related study by Taylor Lyons and Robin Carhart Harris that actually used the same metrics. So these are comparable in the sense that their methodology was identical as far as we can tell from the reported data. So they asked a one-item questionnaire about people's political orientation, coupled with their lifetime experience with psychedelics in the Noor et al. Paper, and then in the Lyons and Carhart Harris paper, in what you can see is a much smaller study sample. This was as an adjunct survey, a part of clinical trials in psilocybin for the treatment of depression. So just to be clear, because that was a controlled study, only 7 people in the Lyons and Carhart Harris paper got psilocybin, and they were asked this one-item questionnaire, as well as a 5-item questionnaire about the degree to which they agreed with various statements that were used to assess their quantitative relationship on a scale of libertarianism and authoritarianism. Whereas the Noor et al. Was a naturalistic study, asking people who either had or had not had experiences with classical psychedelics about their political orientations and comparing those groups. With the Lyons and Carhart Harris, the questionnaire was administered before psilocybin was given as a part of treatment for depression, and then after. Generally speaking, both of these papers had complementary and reinforcing results, which was that they found lower rates of authoritarianism in those who were psychedelic experienced. And so quite a bit of press was devoted to these 2 papers. Newsweek asked, can psychedelics stop oppression? Big Think asked more directly, can magic mushrooms help fight fascism?
And you can see from the dates of those articles, well, it's small, but it says 2018. So these news pieces were circulating right around the time that a lot of money started coming into the space and was being used as a justification in many cases for rapid expansion of psychedelic medicine.
I would also point out that the timing of this these news stories was also concurrent with large events that we will touch on at some point, like the Unite the Right rally, and all of this occurred in the context of the Trump era, where in the United States and global context there was concern about a particular kind of right-wing authoritarianism. I want to be clear that while, yes, of course, left-wing and other forms of authoritarianism exist, we focused this paper on right-wing psychedelia for a number of reasons, mostly in terms of an intervention in a media and research discourse that conflated these results with some other papers that we'll get into later, with a broad idea that psychedelics will, generally speaking, result in more progressive people once they've become experienced with them. The first work engaging with this discourse was on symposia. I wrote some sort of the kernel of putting together counterfactuals to this idea that somehow psychedelics are an antidote to authoritarianism. And that was, as you can see, called Lucy in the Sky with Nazis, Psychedelics, and the Right Wing. This did get a lot of engagement, given that it was published online, engaging with the peer-reviewed research, but not in a peer-reviewed format. As evidence to my claim that my writing had some effect, the Mind Foundation's Eric Lonergan wrote a piece that actually engaged with a number of related pieces that followed that, and some other work in which, as far as we can tell, Eric Lonergan coined the term political pluripotency. And so the idea being that I think we share, which is why we included it in the title of this work, that psychedelics can precipitate shifts and strengthen one's beliefs around ideology, but not in any particular way. For those of you who aren't aware of where that term comes from, pluripotency is a biological term for cells that are differentiating into any different cell type over their developmental life. So the idea is that any direction is possible. So that we're on the same page. Ideology is a system of belief about the world, political theories, policies, in some ways looking at philosophical questions as well, like age-old ones like how shall we live. Broadly over time, we can see major divides between those supporting some form of aristocracy or monarchy and more democratic forms of governance, whether that be at a community level or in a representative level that we have in the United States. This is further drawn out into basic philosophical divides on the use and legitimacy of social hierarchies or the advisability of social equality in various aspects of life and society. We're familiar with feudalism, the idea that kings were divinely ordained to exercise unquestioned rights, and that people were subject to that. Left and right as terms have historical meaning. They refer to a period in the French National Assembly in 1789, where they literally referred to where various warring factions in the revolutionary era, some supporting the monarchy and referred to as the party of order, sat on the right, and those who sat on the left supported revolution. They were the party of the movement. So that is how they have been characterized. Liberalism historically is a counterpoint to feudalism. It challenged that the only sovereign, the only enfranchised individual was getting that power from God. And generally speaking, for those of you aware of your history, this was at the time considered to be mostly propertied white men. And this continued for some time. I did a quick Google search, and I think the last people to be enfranchised voting in the United States were indigenous peoples by 1965. So it took a long time. Market liberalism is the ideology shared by, in the American terms, of both liberals and conservatives. So we can think about liberalism with a capital L and liberalism as a sub-wing of the basal ideology of capitalism that we talk about when we talk about, for instance, Democrats and Republicans. Both of them are capital L liberals in their support for private ownership and control over the economy. We also have libertarians, which is a term that in the United States context is actually somewhat confused. In the international sense, libertarianism is a synonym for socialism, and that's the historically accurate term. We can point to when and where proponents of a right-wing libertarianism, laissez-faire capitalist types, actively co-opted the term. So getting on to where we have focused a lot of our attention in this paper, generally speaking, there are ideologies that are right-wing authoritarian. But I do want to emphasize that, when we're talking about the party of order, we're talking about the ideologies of capitalism, private ownership of the economy. Generally speaking, internationally, these are considered right-wing movements. Do you want to talk about some of this? Okay, so social dominance orientation is generally like a psychological orientation and comfort with hierarchy. There are people who you can measurably show that this is what makes them comfortable. This is what they think is right. And this includes what we generally refer to as conservatives or traditionalists who value certain agrarian and patriarchal values. This can be further refined into ultra-nationalism, where the nation state is held above all others. In the American context, we call this American exceptionalism. Ethno-nationalism is where the state and its legitimacy is conflated with a particular ethnicity. This has, or inevitably does lead to violence, because no geographical area is 100% ethnically heterogeneous or homogeneous. Which leads us to fascism, which has been variously described, but depends on the persecution of outgroups, and in many ways is an ideology of power and hierarchy in its purest and most pragmatic sense. And Nazism adds a hyper-racialized component to that, in that Nazism is more properly considered as an under the umbrella of fascism internationally. And then, of course, neither of these ideologies went away. We have neo-Nazi and neo-fascist movements organizing internationally today. So we quote in the paper the work of Boone, who points out that aristocrats, bankers, German right-wing ex-military men, not to mention the CIA and the Nazis from the 1930s to the 1960s, is a little acknowledged fact that one of the principal sources of interest in psychedelics, aside from the interest of researchers working on specific therapeutic uses, was people of conservative or right-wing orientation. LSD was distributed through a somewhat aristocratic network of psychologists and well-connected individuals. But while this may be known by folks that pay attention to psychedelic history, other traditions are less explored. And I think I would advocate that reckoning with the legacy of institutional experimentation with psychedelics is timely, as some of the same sorts of institutions delve back into psychedelic research. The reality is that the lineage of MKUltra, a program of involuntary and unethical human experimentation with the object of gaining control over people's will, has its roots with experimentation by the Axis, both by the Japanese Empire and by the Nazis. So this is Kurt Plotner. He was a Nazi physician, a member of the SS. He worked at Dachau in Department R. They did experimentation on malaria, infecting individuals and watching the progression of the disease. They were also looking for a truth serum. This was the inspiration for the MKUltra search for a truth serum, which was part of that work. But also, they did work with mescaline and Jews interned in the camps. And we know that Kurt Plotner himself and thousands of other Nazi and Japanese imperial technicians and scientists were imported into the United States and put to work on things like the space program. And also, in the case of Kurt Plotner, kept in like West Germany because they were too toxic to be brought into the United States. So this is a picture of a German Wehrmacht captain. His name is Ernst Jünger. He's a literary figure, often described as complicated. He is also the originator, coiner of the term psychonaut. In his time in occupied France, he served as a Nazi censor. And he was a close personal friend of Albert Hofmann. And when Albert Hofmann wanted someone to share his experiences with, both from a personal, we might call it integrative perspective today, but also from a literal perspective, these two men shared LSD sessions together. Ernst Jünger wrote about his experiences with drugs and was admired such by Albert Hofmann that he devoted an entire chapter to LSD, My Problem Child, entitled The Radiance of Jünger. Jumping to the present, open, self-identified fascists and neo-Nazis organized in the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. This, for those of you who don't remember exactly, this was the Tiki Torch khaki polo march where Heather Heyer, a anti-fascist protester, was killed in an intentional vehicular assault. A lot of the Unite the Right's goals were to organize online fascists and bring them together, IRL, as they say. It was some of it was organized on anonymous Chan boards like 4chan and 8chan, later 8kun, but also had support from the Daily Stormer, the Proud Boys, more extreme groups like Atomwaffen. Atomwaffen is so named because it is their goal to obtain a dirty bomb to use against their enemies. Not only were these organizations affiliated in one way or another with the Unite the Right rally and the violence that occurred there, each of these organizations have members or leaders, and both, who have documented and discussed their own experiences with psychedelics and what it meant specifically with regard to their hierarchical ideology. In the case of the Proud Boys, Gavin McInnes, who was a co-founder of Vice magazine, literally has given advice to his mostly young male audience on how to weather a bad trip. So these people are aware that this is a common occurrence in their communities. This is a headline that happened after the publication of Right-Wing Psychedelia.
Can you read it for in case?
Yes, of course. An Anchorage man's magic mushrooms sales led authorities to swastika stickers, charges say. I believe his Instagram handle was Frosty Fungi, and he was growing mushrooms and selling them, which led to a sting operation. It was only then that police connected him to a spate of swastika propaganda around Anchorage. If you read the paper, you can see where we have mined the Stormfront chat archives for discussion favorable, even knowledgeable of the current research around psychedelics by posters who openly identify themselves as fascists and neo-Nazis. Stormfront, by the way, is the oldest hate site on the web. The Daily Stormer is a newer one, whose founder, Andrew Anglin, has a documented history with a number of psychedelic and hallucinogenic drugs. So after his experimentation with psychedelics, he started one of these organizations. And the same is actually true for Gavin McInnes. Which brings us to the Capitol riots, the insurrection. These individuals were iconic. We see Jacob Chansley, or Yellowstone Wolf, aka the Q Shaman.
And this was the second symposia piece, the subject, right?
This was the second symposia piece that I wrote. This came out the day after the insurrection, and focused on Jacob Chansley, or Jake Angeli, as he was known at the time. Frankly, because I had a hunch that the guy wearing face paint and horns, shirtless, covered in pagan tattoos, might have experience with psychedelics. I found.
Tell the story of the.
Yeah, you know, in the event, you know, a lot of people who attended the riot, the Capitol riots, thought that they would be victorious, that they would overturn the election. And when that didn't happen, many of these people realized that they had just documented their own case against them. And so we now know that many of them attempted to erase their online footprint. The same was the case with the Q Shaman, or Angeli, but suspecting that this might be happening early that morning, I found his Facebook post and watched on my phone as it was deleted from the web, which I was able to record. On Angeli's Facebook page, he was advertising himself as a psychedelic guru, shaman, consultant, and for just $44.44, he could counsel you on your own plant medicine journey and how to deal with your identity as a starseed at Starseed Academy. Much of this is strongly and firmly in the vein of conspirituality, the merger between conspiratorial beliefs, such as those held by Chansley and those of spirituality and the New Age. Along with Chansley, and next to him in the yellow is William Watkins, or Watson. And both of these individuals, I later discovered, were deeply entrenched in psychedelic use. And strangely enough, the tattoos on Watson's hand were what alerted me to his association and led me to dig a little bit more into his history. And on the right, he was being criticized because on his right hand, there's a tattoo that if you squint might look like a sickle and hammer. He was accused of being a secret Antifa crisis actor, which might be believable with his bushy hair and beard. But if you look at his left hand, there's a quite colorful tattoo, which looked familiar. This is the emblem of a dark web website called Pushing Taboo, run by Gamma Goblin, arguably one of the largest and most prolific LSD distributors on the web. Watson was actually out on bail for $106,000 odd for possession of, I think something like 40,000 hits of LSD, like a very large amount. If you want to know what it is exactly, that article was written up as relax, turn off your mind and float right wing. The Q conspiracy has its own psychedelic imagery and themes. This is the hashtag follow the right white rabbit, which has its own psychedelic connotations. But more directly, part of this hashtag and the constellation of conspiracies involved in the Q world is a version of the Jewish anti-Semitic blood libel conspiracy, where Jews, or the manipulators of the world as it's postulated, are bathing in the blood or eating children of the believers. In this case, harvesting adrenochrome from the pineal glands of children to inject into their veins. This is a mildly psychoactive substance with a bit of a history, but it's really not in wide use.
So one of the subjects that we explore in the paper is that a lot of the historical barriers to more elements of the far right using psychedelics are actually shifting. So there's increasingly examples of white supremacist friendly models or in lineages of psychedelic use. So whereas we point out in the paper, something like, an indigenous jungle blend of ayahuasca is not necessarily something that a white supremacist is going to get behind. There's examples like this film that just came out, The Northmen, that has, we haven't seen it yet, but we were reading about how there is a psychedelic initiation scene in the film. And already media have explored the fact that while the filmmakers themselves are not white supremacists, and they felt trying to be careful not to make this film a white supremacist film, nonetheless, media outlets have been covering the fact that white supremacists are hijacking the film, and people are hailing the Nordic lore that's already popular with alt-right groups and ideas about pure masculinity. So these are examples that white supremacists can get behind and kind of encourage future right-wing psychedelic use.
And we want to stress that this love in particular for, say, the Northmen, for example, is not in spite of a scene of psychedelic initiation, but perhaps in part, at least because of it. We point to an example of the Base, a white nationalist group that was active at the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. They were arrested on weapons charges and found to be attempting to manufacture through extraction, most likely dimethyltryptamine. But an infiltrator, not an infiltrator, a member of this group wrote a memoir that was obtained by Vice magazine, in which they describe a pagan ritual that was explicitly intended for group bonding, that involved animal sacrifice. So, quote, "Closer to midnight, we approached the hallowed ground on which the ceremony would be held. We killed and skinned the sheep in what I did and still do consider to be a respectful manner," he writes. "Then drank a sip of his blood from a cup around the dim glow of our torches as a ritual, bringing us closer together as brothers. Some of us also took LSD to celebrate the holiday and the event which had taken place." As you can see, they're pictured with the beheaded animal's skull, which became something of a meme in their Telegram group. Which brings us to psychedelics themselves and what it is that we know that they do. one of the things that psychedelics facilitate subjectively is that they enhance meaning making. This is actually something that those on the right are quite competent in doing. They refer to it as meme magic. Many of you are now aware that the OK symbol was intentionally associated with white pride as a way of both making fools of those who believed this, but also as a secret symbol that those flashing it could use to identify themselves. So we point to the radicalization literature that shows that one of the first steps on the path towards radicalization is a cognitive opening, a destabilizing event that causes a person to doubt their worldview. Basically, psychedelics are suggestion-enhancing drugs. They can cause these kinds of windows for worldview shift, something that Naomi Klein pointed to, specifically using the example of shock therapy and MKUltra, saying that in one of his most influential essays, Milton Friedman articulated contemporary capitalism's core tactical nostrum, what I've come to understand as the Shock Doctrine. He observed that only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. Yeah.
Could you?
Oh, yeah. So, we're going to talk a little bit about deep ecology and ecofascism, the sort of environmental wing of the fascist movement. And Neşe is going to go into some of the, Dr. Dever is going to go into some of the work associated with it. Just as sort of a cultural example, the Handmaid's Tale show talks about Gilead, which is an example of a climate conscious fascist movement. The Volkisch movement is another example where we have people following the footsteps of Hitler and adopting vegetarianism.
And so the context of this conversation about how environmentalism can turn in fascist directions relates to other literature that's come out. So I took a close look at Forsman and Sagioglu's paper here titled "Lifetime Experience with Classic Psychedelics Predicts Pro-Environmental Behavior Through an Increase in Nature-Relatedness," so feeling connected to nature. And their paper was a correlational analysis of almost 1,500 online survey participants. And they focused their questions on 12 headline behaviors that were nested in 4 areas of everyday environmental concern, including domestic resource consumption, waste behavior, transportation use, and eco-friendly shopping. And in their paper, their findings correlated with their predictions, which were that psychedelic experience leads to an ecocentric identification with nature, or feeling one with the larger natural world, and that experience of connection with nature leads to pro-environmental behaviors. In citing citing sources to support their hypotheses, I took a look at the citations that they pointed to. The first citation held that conservatives hold negative views about recreational drug use. For now, I'm going to bracket that, but we're going to come back to that at the end. And they also cited a paper by Schultz and Stone from 1994 that made the case that right-wing authoritarianism was highly negatively correlated with environmental concern. So they were saying that there's evidence that authoritarianism and environmental concern are not things that overlap. So given that we were familiar with the eco-fascist movements, which use the justification of things like climate change or the need to preserve nature with, or they justify fascist or other kinds of authoritarian control over society towards those environmental ends as a counterfactual for this claim. So I looked at the Schultz and Stone paper, And reading closer to what they were in their argument, they were saying that even back in 1994, at the end of their paper, they said, we found, looking at a study of people's views about a power plant and public environmental generally, they found that those things were not correlated, authoritarianism and environmentalism. But they said if you project future trends, and especially looking at the fact that climate change is getting harder and harder to ignore, they predicted in the future, speaking from 1994, that over time, that gulf that they saw was actually going to disappear as more and more people were forced to confront the reality of climate change. So they point to examples, or one of the in the literature on how climate change is getting worse, it includes increases in extreme weather and climate events, including wildfires, flooding, droughts, storms, heat waves, vector-borne diseases, food and water insecurity, and property damage. So even in their citation, there was this kind of undermining of the easy association or negative correlation between authoritarianism and concern about nature. So one of the things that I just wanted to touch on briefly in the justification for when people are talking about why it might be that psychedelics lead to increased pro-environmental behavior, the literature on deep ecology and nature-relatedness more generally has come up again and again. So just as an overview, deep ecology was an environmental philosophy that was founded by two philosophers in the 70s and 80s, and it argues that maladaptive environmental behaviors are symptomatic of Western culture's anthropocentric and utilitarian and individualist attitude towards nature. And they argue that any meaningful behavior change needs to address that underlying sense of separation from nature. Because you can moralize with people and say you should recycle, you should do these things, but if you tap into people's innate sense of self-preservation and, oh, the natural world is me, then people are more motivated to do things in a sustainable, long-lasting way. So deep ecology historically has ties to, unfortunately, fascism. So although deep ecology by itself is not a fascist philosophy, there are historical precedents and kind of synergies between ecofascism and deep ecology. Ecofascism offers totalitarian solutions like ethnic cleansing, and they believe that finite natural resources means that there's justification for preserving those resources in these cases for white people or other powerful groups, because there's not
favored groups.
Favored in groups.
To be clear, there's fascism, for instance, in India today, and such that Hindus would be the group favored in such a plan.
Right. So just in the Forsman-Sagioglu paper, they talk about the self-other overlap as being what seems to be informing pro-environmental behavior. It's also been described elsewhere as allo-inclusive identity, or identity that incorporates the other into the sense of self. And they argue that that increases empathic concern through a two-way process of incorporating the other's features into oneself, or nature in this case, into oneself, and projecting or ascribing one's own characteristics onto the other, and in this case, nature. So, but from the eco-fascist side, there's a whole bunch of sub-themes related to ecofascism. So that includes eco-naturalism, or viewing the natural world as a blueprint for the social order, which Jordan Peterson gets into, which we'll go into in a second. Eco-organicism, viewing the folk or the people as an ecosystem. And then lastly, eco-authoritarianism, or the need for a strong state to deal with the environmental crises efficiently.
We see here Blut and Boden, or blood and soil, which was long a Nazi motto, slogan. And
the fascist potential in deep ecology has long been critiqued by ecofeminists, who have pointed to eco-philosophers who, although they're talking about everything being interconnected, if you read closely into what they're saying, there's actually an instrumentalism, or like a subtle hierarchy. Like everything's one, so I have a right to hunt and torture and exploit animals in this case. It's an example of how feelings of interconnection are still compatible with hierarchies and unequal power relations. And if you could just want to mention this.
Yeah, so the reality of scientific racism, dividing humanity incorrectly into multiple species and subspecies, is broadly a part of the eugenics tradition. There are those who believe in the breeding of intelligence or other desirable traits. This movement in the United States is part of the ideological basis for what the Nazis enacted in a racial nationalist policy.
And when experiences of interconnection are interpreted as interconnection to hierarchy, suddenly it becomes justified to use metaphors like pruning the branches, depending on, the branches can be disabled people or other minorities. And it's the logic of, I'm identifying with the all, so the particular of these specific people don't matter as much. That's what can happen in the eugenics context.
To be clear, and we make clear in the paper, eugenics is a pseudoscience that has been repudiated by modern population geneticists who've identified only one human species and no discernible racial correlation between intelligence.
Can you briefly just introduce?
Yeah, so we're moving on to Jordan Peterson, who's a cultural figure on the right in conservative circles. He is an academic psychologist with many publications, but catapulted himself to fame by sounding the alarm, as he would put it, around the Canadian Human Rights Bill C-16, which was an amendment to human rights protection to include trans people as those a protected group against which hate crime legislation could protect. He claimed that that this legislation would result in compelled speech that would force him by the government to refer to his students by their preferred pronouns, and that this was a steady march towards Maoist tactics that would end up with people being imprisoned for not complying with governmentally compelled speech.
But to this day, there's been no arrests for misuse of pronouns in Canada, and it was completely mischaracterizing the bill.
He's been roundly rebuked by legal scholars in Canada.
And more recently, in the past few weeks, he's made a kind of pivot towards criticizing a new bill, Bill C-67, which he's characterizing as a critical race theory bill. So a lot of the same kind of hysterics around, the government overreaching is now kind of continuing in this new component. But just the part that I have at the bottom here, from Jordan Peterson's perspective, hierarchy and dominance hierarchy is what holds up all of society and keeps the darkness at bay in society. And so from Jordan Peterson's perspective, social justice warriors who are advocating for what he talks about as equality of outcome are threatening the very mechanism in society that kind of shuttles people to the appropriate place in the hierarchy and allows for society to continue.
And not just in society. He's commonly associated with his metaphor of the lobster having dominant hierarchies, and so he posits that it is in our very genes to be a part of hierarchical relations.
So he selectively takes metaphors from the natural world and says that his ideology is the natural ideology because he can find one example, but there are lots of other examples they could be drawing on. But this, if I could capture Jordan Peterson's ideology in one picture, I would point to this meme that is referred to as soldiers holding up society, because his perspective is basically like that the people who are advocating for trans people or women's equality or racial equality are doing so because the dominance hierarchy is creating the foundations for people to complain, and they are kind of acting out of turn, not realizing how grateful they should be for their place in the hierarchy.
and infrequently using self-help language to admonish people to set their house not well in order, not clean the room a little bit, but perfectly before one criticizes the world.
And his myth is kind of overall myth that he keeps referring to describe why, you know, things like the trans bill or the critical race theory bill should not be a thing, as he's comparing it to Cain and Abel from the book of Genesis. So in that story, there's one son who does everything right and is able to succeed, and the other one is kind of just embittered by the fact that he's not on top of the status hierarchy, and in a rage lashes out against and kills the brother. And so he compares this dynamic to social justice warriors who are seeking to destroy all of existence in the most hyperbolic sense, but due to a sense that they deserve more than their lot actually justifies them.
To sort of paraphrase, shaking their fists at God for the pain of existence.
So the reason we've been talking about Jordan Peterson is that Jordan Peterson recently has made a hard pivot towards psychedelics. He's been interested in psychedelics for a long time, but I'm showing a brief clip from his conversation last year with Roland Griffiths, who's at Johns Hopkins doing research there. And Jordan Peterson, as an example, shows how these kind of authoritarian leaning ideologies are entirely compatible with psychedelic experiences of interconnection. And it shows that he's broadcasting the benefits of psychedelics to right-wing people through his very substantial platform. He has almost 5 million followers on YouTube. In association, again, with Roland Griffiths, who, to be clear, has headed the Johns Hopkins Center for Consciousness and Psychedelic Research, and is largely credited with restarting the Renaissance in psychedelic research. They reveal in this longer conversation that they've been friends for 20 years. As we said earlier, Jordan Peterson was a traditional academic in psychology. So I'm about to show, it's a few minute long clips, but just a lot of our research comes from media analysis, because a lot of the right-wing kind of discourse is happening online. So just to give some insight to the ideas that are being shared.
There's this sense of the interconnectedness of all people, all things, the unity.
Yeah, the meaningful interconnectedness, not just connected, but also that the entire pattern of connection has some transcendent or ultimate significance.
What's more important than this, Jordan?
I actually can't believe how important this is. And I've been studying the psychedelic literature for 20 years in as deep a manner as I can possibly manage. And every time I think I have some grasp on how important it is, I learn something else and I think, oh, it's way more important than I thought it was. It's of crucial significance. It's literally of central significance. It's literally of central significance. Our life is dependent on death. Our cells are constantly dying, and if death isn't regulated properly within us, we get cancer. So the fact of our healthy existence is actually dependent on death itself. The proper amount of death keeps us healthy. That's also true psychologically. You have to let old concepts die, and they don't like to die. It's a painful experience to have the old you die in the light of new experience. It's painful enough so that people will resist it. But there's this benevolent death that's a reparative mechanism. When I've allowed my intuitions to extend themselves as far as possible, I think, well, that's true of being itself. In the manner that we can't comprehend, death plays a restorative role. And a glimpse of that shows you that there's more going on than you think.
So that point he just made, a glimpse of that shows you that there's more going on than you think. He's referring back to that Abel and Cain relationship, where it's like, you think you have a right to lash out against the order of the cosmos. Who are you to be making those sorts of claims? Get back in line. And the idea is that interconnection can be interconnection to hierarchy. And he naturalizes, in the next clip I'm going to show, he emphasizes how his view is that the entire world is a nested fractal hierarchy as a way of justifying why that structure exists in society.
Did you say last night, of the 100,000 most recently printed books, only 1,000 have sold more than 1 million?
Yeah, it's something like that.
Power law's all the way down.
Yeah, everywhere. Power law, that's, a tiny minority of people do all the work, a tiny minority of people get all the benefit. tiny minority of athletes score all the goals. A tiny minority of men get all the women, etc. A tiny minority of stars have all the mass. A tiny minority of rivers have all the water. A tiny minority of cities have all the people, etc., etc., etc. Everywhere, always. You know, and we're so clueless in our culture that we blame that on capitalism. It's like, how does that account for the massive stars, people?
So this clip is Jordan Peterson on Stefan Molyneux's podcast discussing race and IQ. At the time, I want to be transparent that Stefan Molyneux was what we would call a crypto-fascist. He did not openly identify himself with fascist or hard right beliefs. He considered himself a radical right libertarian. He's since much more identified with an open fascist, open white nationalist view. The conversation that Jordan Peterson and Stefan Molyneux have here is revealing.
IQ is a particularly ugly aspect of science because the IQ literature reveals that which no one would want to be the case, which is that there are profound and virtually irremediable differences in people's cognitive performance, and that those differences have a very solid biological and heritable basis. No one wants to hear that. They don't want to hear that it's biological. They don't want to hear that it's heritable. They don't want to hear it's permanent. They don't want to hear that it's irremediable and that it actually has a practical consequence. And no wonder they don't want to hear it.
Well, and even worse, they don't want to hear that it differs between genders and ethnicities. That is, to me, one of the most painful things that I've ever learned in my life is this kind of information. It is one of the great heartbreaks when it comes to the dream of pure egalitarianism. And that is, I think, even harder. It's an even harder pill for people to swallow.
Yeah, well, the gender differences in IQ look relatively trivial, but there are differences in ethnicity that don't look trivial. The Ashkenazi Jews, for example, have on average a 15-point advantage over the rest of the Caucasian population, which is sufficient to account for their radical overrepresentation in positions of authority and influence and productivity. You know, and I am, to just so that it's absolutely clear, I am not saying that's a bad thing. I'm saying there's a real reason for it that no one wants to contend with.
So to be clear, this racial hierarchy of IQ that Jordan Peterson is referring to, one can find this trend in the literature. Also, to situate the IQ test itself, it was a test developed by eugenicists to do eugenics better. That said, much of the debate surrounding IQ is centering the entire genetic basis of any differences in this test that have been found and downplaying environmental effects. For example, poverty can cause a tenfold difference in IQ in this literature. But the hierarchy that he is referring to that places Ashkenazi Jews at the top is one that is actually used by Nazis to explain their worldview, in that intelligent Jews, their cleverness is the reason why they have been able to manipulate the world. And this literature that he's nodding to explicitly later in the clip, referencing the bell curve, places African American or black people at the bottom of this hierarchy.
So when he's talking about psychedelics make you realize you're interconnected to everything and that there's more going on than you think, he's also saying that people who are lower in the hierarchy need to just accept their place in that hierarchy. So the other point I wanted to get to is that recently Jordan Peterson has been speaking out in favor of conversion therapy,
which has a dark history in psychedelic therapy.
Historically.
Yeah,
and in my work in psychedelic bioethics, and also I have collaborated on qualitative research with NYU and Johns Hopkins. There's a lot of literature kind of suggesting that one of the ways that psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy might be so effective therapeutically is that it supports, the theory goes, shifting people's sense of self in a direction such as I no longer identify as being a smoker. And so it's easier for me to quit smoking, kind of getting back to that deep ecology idea that if you identify with nature, it's easier to change behavior. But what happens when conservatives start getting into psychedelic therapy for conversion therapy? What happens if Uyghur Muslims in China are given psychedelic therapy to try to change their sense of self and their connections to their culture? These are topics that we feel like are really important to be aware of and to anticipate as right-wing components of society become more and more invested in psychedelics. So I'll just play this clip.
The issue that you started to become really politically prominent on, which is the Bill C-16, the gender issue.
Yeah.
But I think the fundamental good of humanity relies on basic acknowledgments of biological truth, especially when it comes to gender.
In Canada, because they banned conversion therapy, it's now all affirmation therapy.
Right, this is
There's no such
insane.
thing as affirmation therapy.
It's insane. The semantic game that was used in order to say, well, conversion therapy, which was at one time using electric shock to treat homosexuals,
Yeah.
and saying that that's the same thing as you have a gender-confused 12-year-old.
Look, I had a 14-year-old kid who was a client of mine. Now this idea is you come to me with an axiomatic claim, whatever it is about your identity, and my job is to rubber stamp it. It's like, I'm not a therapist then. So this is not only insane, this insistence, the notion that therapists affirm is an anti-truth.
And along those lines, recently he's been talking also on Joe Rogan about trans identity as being a form of social contagion. So I'll play this clip.
The high trade openness people, they're the ones that are more likely to have green hair and red hair and lots of piercings and lots of tattoos, and they have trouble catalyzing a single identity. And then if you throw in categorical confusion, which is exactly what you're doing when you declare that there's, an endless number of gender identities, then people who are prone to identity dissociation and to psychogenic contagion, you're going to demolish them.
There is an obsession.
Abigail Schreier has documented that quite nicely in her book, Irreversible Damage. So you think, well, perhaps a few people who are transgender benefited from this new reality, but for everyone who's benefited, and I'd like to see the data just showing how much they actually benefited. That'll take a long time to accrue. There's 1,000 people who've been just demolished by this.
So when you follow, for imagining listening to Jordan Peterson from his far right audience, he's saying things like psychedelics reveal that the hierarchy is natural in society, that we have to accept that death is sometimes what is necessary to keep things healthy. You combine this with trans and other kinds of feminist views as being a form of social contagion that's trying to disrupt the order of society. And suddenly, in Nazi Germany, there was this social cleansing that was advocated. So the Jews were portrayed as a kind of cancer that needed to be purged to protect society. And so we're hearing the same kinds of discourses around Jordan Peterson, and he's acknowledging in this next clip that coding things as cancer justifies atrocities. So he's not putting those points together explicitly, but for his far right wing listeners who know that history of coding things as cancer, they can connect the dots and potentially lead towards violent actions.
This idea that the planet has too many people on it. There's no sentiment more implicitly genocidal. What do you propose to do about that exactly? Mass abortion, is that your answer? Or should we do something a little more dramatic? It's associated with a deeply rooted existential self-hatred. Humanity is like a cancer on the planet, unchecked growth, just like a cancer. It's okay. We know where your heart is located. Because what's the implications for a doctrine like that? What do you do with the cancer?
Cut it out.
Yeah, that's for sure. Poison it or whatever. There's nothing you don't do to a cancer. So you're going to use a metaphor like that? There's too many people on the planet. You're going to use a metaphor like that? And then you're going to also decide that you're virtuous while you're using it because you're on the side of the planet, whatever the hell that means.
So he's using metaphors like that, and he's using it in a way that he's saying is going to support the ongoing legacy of Western society. And he's using psychedelics to fit into that narrative. So that's why I wanted to tie those pieces together. And I'm not going to go into this. I just want to briefly point to this is because my background, my PhD is in comparative literature. And so one of the kind of things that the humanities have to bring to these conversations is pointing to the ways that Jordan Peterson's ideology, for example, has long-time precedence in even Western cultures. This is a poem, an essay on man by Alexander Pope, and it goes into, it's in a footnote in the paper, but he basically mentions how all of reality is this great nested fractal chain of being, and to try to disrupt one piece of that, like by abolishing slavery, is to throw the whole system into chaos. And so everyone's role is exactly where they are. And so the slave should feel proud of their role as slave because it enables the system to function.
To break the chain, a link in the chain is to destroy the chain. So in our work with looking at the association between conservatives and psychedelics, we came across the first instance that we can find of using the red pill as a metaphor for radical politics on the right. The process of radicalization, taking the red pill, actually maps back to this quote by neo-reaction, dark enlightenment thinker Mencius Moldbug or Curtis Yarvin, in which he compares it, his work, as it's like talking about a mild DMT trip. If it wasn't mild, it wasn't DMT, or if it was mild, it wasn't DMT. He says, we know about red pills, many claim to sell them. You can go, for example, to any bookstore and ask the guy behind the counter for some Noam Chomsky. What you'll get is blue pills soaked in red, number 3. So here's this commonplace metaphor used on the right all the time. There are subreddits on it. There was a documentary on the manosphere on taking the red pill. Its first usage in this matter directly compared to a potent tryptamine. We want to acknowledge the debt of some of this work to Alan Piper, who explored this in an excellent monograph called Strange Drugs Make for Strange Bedfellows. I do recommend reading it, but in it he explores a trend that he saw where Inner Traditions, which is a common, a prominent psychedelic publisher, actually published the works of Julius Evola, who is an occultist, was an occultist philosopher, Italian, who put forth a lot of the ideology that inspired the fascists. And this collection, when he looked at who had actually published it, was Michael Moynihan of the band Blood Axis, an open neo-Nazi in the neo-folk musical tradition. And he had also published the collected works of James Mason, which are a movement Bible on the far right today, a group of writings called Siege, which advocate for accelerationist lone wolf tactics for the destruction of what they considered to be the decadent West for the reinstallation of traditional values. This leads to the most direct psychedelic link in this duo, the husband and wife duo that make up Blood Axis, Annabelle Lee. Annabelle Lee actually translated one of my favorite books, the Encyclopedia of Psychoactive Plants, and has also done work on translation of Albert Hoffman's writings. So there is this trend of very interested and informed open psychedelic Nazis. We want to transition to a term we've used a lot at symposia called corporedelia, and talking about them in the context of a right-wing ethos. Corporedelic is an adjective that describes manifesting corporate structures, ethos or logic within the context of the psychedelic landscape. It was coined independently by Dr. Catherine McLean, who's at Johns Hopkins doing psilocybin research, and former Symposia co-founder Brett Green. Also corporedelia, the world of people, phenomenon, or items associated with corporedelic entities. So what are we talking about here? Well, we could call it the shroom boom. These are all of the privately held psychedelic corporations that were identifiable when I made these slides, and also the publicly held, publicly traded psychedelic companies. Many of you may be aware of Compass Pathways, but there are many many others of these groups who have moved into the space.
So, and I'm just going to very quickly refer to work that I've done with my co-author Alex Guerin on psychedelic medicalization here. So the corporadelic boom is happening within the context of neoliberal capitalism, which is offering market-based solutions to social problems. And neoliberalism originated as a theory of political economic practices, but based on the assumption, in the words of David Harvey, that, quote, human well-being can best be advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills within an institutional framework characterized by strong property rights, free markets, and free trade. And as this ideology increasingly came to dominate global commerce, neoliberalism infiltrated the private subjective realm as a hegemonic mode of discourse that, quote, had pervasive effects on ways of thought to the point where it became incorporated into the common sense way that many of us interpret, live in, and understand the world, and end quote from Harvey. So living under neoliberal capitalism, individuals continuously have to confront psychological pressures to succeed and persevere as atomized individuals in increasingly precarious social arrangements and jobs, et cetera. So neoliberal advocates for psychedelic medicine, or the corporadelic set, often conceptualize distress as a neurochemical and behavioral problem to be solved at the level of the individual, and they're offering solutions to that. And so in various ways, this individualization of the social conceives of individualist and medicalized solutions to challenges posed by authoritarianism and climate change. Because as this book, James Davies, recently published, sedated How Modern Capitalism Created Our Mental Health Crisis. And James Davies is currently going to be coming to Ohio State for a conference that we're going to describe at the very end, which we're getting close to. But the idea here is that corporadelic actors are citing the papers that we put early in the presentation to justify why there has to be this rapid scaling of psychedelic medicine to get into as many bodies and minds as possible, as quickly as possible, even claiming that the future of the planet depends on this kind of psychedelic expansion. But we point to the fact that this is a bit of a bait and switch going on, because it's actually, if you look at authoritarianism and climate change, there's a lot of evidence connecting those movements to the rise of inequality fostered by capitalism. And so psychedelic capitalism here is purporting to offer solutions to something that systemically capitalism is actually furthering.
It's also a great marketing pitch, but we point to Atai Life Sciences, which is the largest psychedelic investor in the space, and a kind of chemical wellness that we might liken to the corporate wellness programs and meditation retreats that your work might offer you. CEO Christian Angermeyer has posited that their company portfolio has cures for ending the mental health crisis because, quote, we are building a world that is bad for our brains. And when he says we are building that world, as somebody who has significant resources to bear and sits on the advisory board of His Excellency Paul Kagame, the authoritarian president of Rwanda, he has significant influence to build that world. It should be noted that Paul Kagame is known internationally as an authoritarian strongman who has extensively, his human rights abuses have been documented by Human Rights Watch, and that authoritarian regimes effectively require human rights abuses to function. So we point to how a lot of these narratives around elite consciousness expansion have been put on the table by some aspects of psychedelic advocates. Tim Ferriss is a sort of a self-help guru, and he was quoted saying, "The billionaires I know, almost without exception, use hallucinogens on a regular basis. In the paper, we document many of the billionaires who are on record about their own psychedelic use or have been documented elsewhere as having used them, including currently the world's richest man, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Minecraft founder Notch Pearson, who himself has espoused virulently anti-trans and right-wing worldviews, Bob Parsons of GoDaddy, and Peter Thiel, who has a unique position in this conversation about psychedelics and commercialization. It should be said that all billionaires are effectively authoritarians in the sense that they maintain a system of vast wealth inequality that they benefit from. So Peter Thiel is a patron of both psychedelics and the far right. He led an investment round and has a stake of $12 million in Atai Life Sciences, was an early investor in Compass, and also has a company called Palantir, which could be called a digitally empowered fascism by researchers who have looked at this work. Palantir is a data aggregation surveillance firm, and Peter Thiel likes to name his companies after Lord of the Rings references. And yes, this is a Palantir. So Peter Thiel has written for the Cato Institute that he finds that democracy and liberty, as he understands it, are incompatible. In the same essay, he laments women's suffrage. And BuzzFeed reported that he had made overtures to white nationalists while supporting Donald Trump. And in his work where he broke company with democracy, he explicitly pointed to Mencius Moldbug, neo-reactionary author, Yarvin, who also was the head of a software company that Peter Thiel funded. Moldbug called Thiel privately in emails to Milo Yiannopoulos of Breitbart as fully enlightened, politically speaking. So, yeah, so this is Jonathan Lubecki, a MAPS employee who introduced himself to me and others as a conservative whisperer. He is a lobbyist for MAPS. This is his public story. And this kind of lobbying is a kind of realpolitik to further psychedelic medicalization by appealing to narratives about veterans and PTSD, and has facilitated political connections between MAPS and psychedelic reformers and far-right characters, including the Mercer family, who are acknowledged by a Republican insider as being the chief international funders of white nationalism. Rebecca Mercer here shown on one of Rick Doblin's slides.
So to be clear, so this is Doblin proudly broadcasting the alliances he's making with far right-wing actors. Right. So
Rebecca Mercer is the founder of Parler and Breitbart. Breitbart is a white nationalist outlet. Parler was helped to organize. It was a platform for communication among the Capitol rioters. And her father, Robert Mercer, is the founder, along with Steve Bannon, of Cambridge Analytica, which used big data tactics to get Brexit and Trump elections.
To manipulate voters to behave in certain ways.
Yes. So we want to point to a very consistent narrative that Rick Doblin, we point to this in the paper, that has, for decades, Rick Doblin has been advancing systemic change facilitated by psychedelic-induced consciousness shifts that will have geopolitical world peace objectives by helping radical fundamentalists move to a more mystical orientation. So this we designate this as a sort of ends justify the means tactic, where if this is what you believe, then working with anyone is worth it to achieve this goal. We point to cultures of psychedelic authoritarianism within the traditions of psychedelic therapy underground and the history of psychedelic investigation, which is really adequate, really amazingly put together in a podcast collaboration with New York Mag with our colleagues, Dr. Lily K. Ross and Dave Nichols. And we do some commentary on that at Symposia, so for more information, check those out. But there's also a history of association of psychedelic use between new religious movement leaders or cult leaders. Shinrikyo used LSD to induce mystical experiences, but was associated with terroristic violence with sarin gas in the Tokyo subway, which injured thousands and killed more than a dozen. The Rajneeshis perpetrated a biological attack to rig an election in Oregon in the 80s. Nick Sands of Orange Sunshine fame, a chemist, lived in Pune and manufactured, according to Tim Scully, massive quantities of LSD. And of course, the Manson family. So
just to show, maybe we can take this one, or I'll just play it. This is almost the end. So in this one, Ben Shapiro, who we saw earlier, is talking to Dave Rubin and Jordan Peterson about psychedelic medicalization and really emphasizing how conservatives who previously were not interested in taking psychedelics because they were illegal and they like following laws, now with medicalization, there's more of an on-ramp and entryway for certain people like Ben Shapiro to join, to take psychedelics, for example.
The quit smoking, 85% success rate with one mystical experience on psilocybin produces 85% cessation rate in smoking. 3 treatments with MDMA, that's what the current research indicates, produces a 72% cure rate for intractable post-traumatic stress disorder. It's like, those are miracle cures, and they have to be accompanied by the mystical experience. I'm pointing out that there are undeniable realms of human experience that involve a sense of the infinite transcendent that you cannot deny.
And I've done a lot of those things that you just mentioned and virtually always had good experiences on them. Now, as someone that I'm pretty sure has never smoked weed,
no, I've never
you haven't eaten mushrooms, you haven't, you haven't done MDMA and all that stuff.
I barely will take a drink.
I did them in college. I had a couple of those type of transcendent feeling. I was just part of something, whatever. But so when you hear all this, as someone that doesn't partake in any of this stuff, what do you make of that? That people can perhaps use some substances that you're not down with on a personal level to get to a place that I think you actually think is a good place.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is that it depends on the level of expertise of the person using it is what I would suggest. The idea, like, I'm not against prescription medication. So if you're talking about, an actual program that's going to better somebody's life, that's one thing. But if it's somebody who's just, I want to have a religious experience, let me pop some LSD, then there's some serious downsides to drugs that.
So more conservatives are going to be taking.
It was hands down the single most meaningful and important and life enriching thing I've ever done in my whole life, full stop. Nothing really comes close. Actually, for 2 years, I was looking around, are there any companies I can invest in? There weren't, and then I did it myself.
So what's that like when you're like, all right, I'm gonna be the magic mushroom guy? And I should tell you, I've done magic mushrooms many times and I've always loved doing it. But sort of what I think is interesting about you also is that you're basically, but I don't want to put words in your mouth, you're basically politically a conservative. And I think it's kind of, there's like this dichotomy between, wait a minute, he's a conservative, but also he's the magic mushroom guy. I sort of say that's what the new sort of conservative thing is. So can you talk a little bit about that and then how you went ahead and said, okay, we're gonna make this into a business?
We have to create a world where we all have a place. How do psychedelics come into it? By the way, most religions are based on psychedelics. You feel connected to nature and other humans. A lot of people feel disconnected from everything. And I think we need that spirituality back in our world. And my view is, religion is like, whatever you believe, it's definitely healthy for you.
I forgot to mention, that's Christian Ingermeyer, who's behind the Thai Life Sciences. And so, just one thing that I wanted to mention. So we've been in communication with Douglas Rushkoff, who was involved in early psychedelic work, also early internet stuff. And we've been talking about the fact that in the early internet, a lot of the exuberance about how the internet was democratizing and connecting everyone around the planet there was a naivete to that allowed for this corporate takeover to happen and didn't need to play out the way it is, where there's big corporations running the internet. So I would like to posit that we're in a similar moment with psychedelics, where we have the opportunity to build a psychedelic system of, a discipline, a field, and evidence-based science, and reaching out to different kinds of communities, indigenous groups, underrepresented people, and build a kind of psychedelic medicine that works for everyone. But it's not going to happen all by itself.
Right. So the idea here is that interdisciplinary perspectives that take seriously the things that people say and compare them to the beliefs and actions that they take in the marketplace, have things to contribute to the psychedelic discourse towards making a more democratic and inclusive post-prohibitionary world. Just to re-emphasize, belief shifts with psychedelics do in fact happen, but we don't have evidence that they do so in a consistent manner, or at least not great evidence. And ultimately, the idea that individual solutions are going to be a replacement for material systemic change, for example, action on climate change, is something that is already widely critiqued in the humanities. And also, as mainstreaming proceeds in the American context, in the existing sphere of belief, as we saw with Ben Shapiro, acknowledging that institutional sanctioning of psychedelic medicine would in fact change his mind on psychedelics. We point to the discourse on psychedelic chaplaincy to simply state that it is very likely that we will see some sort of psychedelic prosperity gospel megachurch emerging in the United States.
Thank you to everyone for bearing with us through a very long presentation. These are folks that we'd like to thank and are affiliated with, and except for the school year, but the others we're affiliated with. And we'd just like to really encourage people. So 10 years ago, I helped organize the first university-sponsored academic conference in psychedelics at the University of Pennsylvania, sponsored by UPenn, Ivy League Medical School. And 10 years later, we're bringing psychedemia back for the first time since then at OSU, really emphasizing on a democratic, all career stage, all disciplines are respected and really appreciated, and kind of coming together for an evidence-based conversation about how we can move psychedelics forward in a way that is supportive of society at large. So psychedemiaconference.org, we encourage you to share with people you know and to submit an abstract by May 6th. So it's coming out.
And to be clear, this is in partnership with the Center for Psychedelic Drug Research and Education at The Ohio State University,
which is a newly launched center there.
Yeah. So thank you for your patience and attention. We're happy to take questions, both in present and from Zoom.
Thank you.
That was fascinating. Thank you. And you made a very powerful case that psychedelics can be used for good or ill. It does raise the question of sort of those questions of mystical experience, the transcendent experience, the loss of sense of self. Do you want to weigh in whether that is a good or bad thing that happens?
So the question is related to the, just repeating for the online folks, mystical experience and the ego dissolution and the loss of the sense of self, and whether that's good or bad. Is there inherently good or bad?
I mean, I think there could be an argument for these kinds of experiences being, enhancing to well-being. I would also say, though, that just looking at what happens when you speak to somebody who's been non-consensually dosed at a high level, and they will not talk about that experience as having been beneficial. So as with many of the things that we referred to in this talk, context matters quite a bit. Set and setting, all of that.
I think that there is a lot of evidence that there can be a therapeutic benefit in your sense of self as an isolated anxious individual going away and feeling empathy and concern for others around you, that can lead to more awareness of our reliance on each other and the nature of systemic problems, that the importance of solidarity and organizing for social change, but that's a latent potential that comes out of an experience like ego dissolution that needs to be cultivated. And there's other ways of cultivating ego dissolution that are harmful and antisocial.
And to be clear, we should expect competing visions for how that should be managed and contextualized.
Well, thanks so much for that talk. I'll use, I think, the highest phrase I can use in an academic context, a challenging talk. It makes you think. My question is related to the image that you've got up here and final bullet point you put, that solving solutions at the individual level doesn't precipitate systemic change or address systemic problems. And I think that's fair, but my question is, for that young koala in this image who's in a deforested area, is it fair to offer nothing? And is it inherently negative to try and address individual problems in parallel with society?
Yeah, I would say addressing the koala is very real, because the question is it ethical to treat the koala even though there are these systemic issues causing the anxiety or the harm to the individual koala in this image? And I would say it's absolutely important to approach these problems from all directions. I think that the issue is some of the corporadelic actors are focusing exclusively on the individualistic solutions. So things like resilience can help people be better organizers and have the capacity to protest and kind of agitate for change in a productive way. But when that becomes the focus at the expense of the environmental pollution that we are all in, or in the case of Christian Angermeyer, who says the world is just getting bad for human brains. Oh, well, maybe we should push back on that narrative. It's like, why are we kind of going along with that? But I do agree that approaching it from both sides simultaneously seems like a good way to go.
I would just also like to point out, and not to be pedantic, but in this particular image, we're dealing with a koala whose source of food has been cut down. Koalas only eat eucalyptus leaves. So the only solution for this koala is, in fact, more eucalyptus leaves. So.
Yeah, thank you.
Maybe from the Zoom participants.
There's one question in the chat. Vincent said, fantastic talk. Would you agree
should I read it here?
Yeah, you got it. Thank you.
The question says, fantastic talk. Would you agree that many right-wing groups are predatory in the sense that they utilize the cognitive opening as an opportunity to recruit prospective group members?
So, I don't have the kind of data that could adequately answer that question. And I think that in terms of characterizing one's political opponents as predatory, I'm not sure how helpful it is. But I would say, that there are recruitment tactics that are well known on the right that capitalize on particularly young men's dismay, the disconnect between a world. It's literally a right-wing meme. This is what was stolen from you. This is it's pointing to an idealized golden age of patriarchal worship that is not available to these young men. And so that cognitive dissonance, yes, that to that degree it is exploited as a recruitment tactic.
I'm trying to read this.
Some
questions.
Yeah, some questions. You mentioned that Jordan Peterson cherry picks natural metaphor like lobsters and hierarchy. Are you aware of any ecological phenomenon that doesn't display a hierarchy?
That's the first question. Do you want to answer?
Okay, so thank you for allowing me to flex some of my evolutionary ecology chops. I'll do my best to answer this. There are a number of organisms that are clonal, that don't organize themselves in discernible hierarchical means. Interdependence, redundancy, these kinds of things are strewn about in broad patterns across nature. There are feedback loops of interdependence that we can see in cell replication or in gene replication. And all of these display multiple mechanisms of control and interaction, and simplifying everything to a hierarchical relationship not only doesn't comport with the evidence of the vast diversity of organizational principles across species and at multiple levels of organization in life systems, but it's also kind of sad and boring to view the world through that lens.
Well, it's also, Jordan Peterson uses a straw man argument where he says, if you get rid of hierarchy, then there's no way to discern competency from incompetence. And I would fundamentally challenge that idea that through evidence-based assessment of situations, you can tell if someone's a good surgeon. You're not saying, he has this idea of equality of outcome, that any old person can pick up a knife on the street and suddenly start doing surgery, but that is not, hierarchy and evidence-based assessment of competency are not the same thing.
I would also just sort of come back and try and point to a specific answer to answer as a counterpoint to the kind of examples that Jordan Peterson uses. Citing the work of, for example, Jane Goodall, who spent her career observing primates. She said that no chimpanzee is dominant in all situations. That older chimpanzees with more wisdom and experience were deferred to in complicated situations of novelty, whereas stronger or younger or more vigorous chimpanzees were deferred to when those traits were necessary. So just relying on that example, we see ways in which the dominance hierarchy is not a universal narrative. And also on the right wing, the concept of being an alpha, taken from study of wolves. That research was based on wolves in captivity, and the author of that research has repudiated the sort of misuse of that worldview. That's not how wolves behave when they are not in cages. I believe you reduced Peter Thiel quite a bit. I'm not sure what that means. The far right and LGBT community are typically opposed. Perhaps it's important to mention that Peter Thiel is one of the only billionaires that is gay and married to a man.
So we should note that when we showed Angermeyer and Rubin,
both of those individuals are
gay.
And also Angermeyer is allegedly a billionaire himself.
Yeah, he claims to be. So one thing that's important in the literature on fascism, fascist organizations are happy to kind of temporarily make allegiances with out groups as long as it serves their interests. But over time, as fascist groups gain power, it's a first in, first out historically, where it's like they will temporarily, like Ben Shapiro is a Jew. There's a lot of people who, or there's Candace Owens is Black, for example.
Ben Shapiro used to be a writer for Breitbart, and according to BuzzFeed, emails obtained by BuzzFeed, Breitbart commentator Milo Yiannopoulos coordinated with open white nationalists and neo-Nazis on much of his work. So it is fair to say that Breitbart is a white nationalist mouthpiece.
So just, and emphasize that just because there are some people on the far right that are from marginalized groups does not suggest that the far right is hospitable towards marginalized
And
groups.
just to mention, and maybe I'm intentionally warping this, but I take Peter Thiel quite seriously, and I don't think I'm reducing him. And I'm watching his actions in the space that I'm concerned about.
And then there's another question. Is there any studies looking at baseline beliefs? Right-wing authoritarians might be interested in psychedelics, but do they actually change? I know multiple people who were right-wing involved in psychedelics, but generally just became more conspiratorial. Bob Altmaier suggests openness is a core element of right-wing authoritarians, which psychedelics are theorized to change. At the same time, I could see some drugs like MDMA boosting oxytocin tied to in-group bonding, making people more right-wing. There was one N=1 study that we cited in the paper where there was a white supremacist, or
it was a part of an MDMA trial, and they actually had been recently subjected to online doxing, meaning their identity had been revealed and connected to their white national or white supremacist organizing by an anti-fascist, and this caused him distress. And during his MDMA experience, he did call into question his white nationalist beliefs. However, after a couple of after a follow-up, he reverted to these beliefs.
And there's one more question here. Considering your overall argument, would it be safe to say that you're in agreement with Ido Hartogsone's theory of cultural set and setting? In other words, the meaning-enhancing properties of psychedelics like psilocybin, simply put, enhance or amplify the cultural set and setting these substances are consumed in.
I think it's fair to say, and I'm citing Hartogson and actually opened up Lucy in the Sky with Nazis, with an assertion that writ large, the cultural set and setting of the psychedelic renaissance is actually capitalism.
And so, so the idea of the cultural set and setting is that the cultural constructs that we live under encourage and suppress the possibilities of individual set and setting. So it's like our larger point with critiquing capitalist kind of takeover of psychedelics, or the attempt to, is that the possibility of gaining insight into systemic change is actually decreased when you're surrounded by neoliberal capitalist trained therapists who are emphasizing certain kinds of interpretations over others. So it's not a neutral, the way that we scale matters for the kinds of experiences that we're encouraging.
And I would just point to how many of the players in the psychedelic renaissance hail from Silicon Valley, come from personal extreme experiences of ego dissolution and mystical experience, and then very shortly after, in many cases, their first thought is to operationalize this as an app or a startup, all of which is a reflection of the larger pressures and reward systems in society.
So I would argue that from your excellent presentation that we have people on the left, people on the right that are taking psychedelics and feeling that in general they are a positive effect on their behavior, their life. We're also finding, as you've alluded to, some really strong evidence that there is a therapeutic benefit in the proper administration of these under controlled settings. So it's not really clear to me what the takeaway is. You've given us a warning shot that what we see as perhaps a promotion of psychedelics in greater use is not so much from the liberals, but also that there may be a conservative intent there. Is this an argument that we should not, that we should resist the commercialization or the recreationalization of psychedelics, and we should be more firm in keeping this a restricted medical use?
So the question for those online relates to, given the concerns that we raised, does that make an argument against the medicalization of psychedelics or
the decriminalization, recreational use, but the preservation only of controlled medical use? Is that correct? Okay. Correct.
So in a paper I have coming out in a bit, I do an analysis of Michael Pollan in the New York Times was really advocating for highly hierarchical modes of access in the West. So whether it's churches, and he only lists syncretic Christianity aligned churches, or spas for the elites, or medicalization clinics. So I would personally advocate for preventing hierarchical approaches to psychedelic access from being the only mode of access that people are allowed to have access to. I think it also is really important to think strategically about what medicalization looks like, because if we have authoritarian leaning guides or sitters,
facilitators,
who are friends with powerful people and have been kind of allowed to maintain their power over vulnerable people who are coming to them, some people in the medicalization side of things say we need to not cause any undue attention to this. We need to be focused on the
apolitical.
goal. we need to be apolitical. And our position is that it matters if you're putting authoritarian type people in a room with vulnerable populations, and that we need to be really careful about, is the therapist there to actually support the person's experience, or are they there because they have some unresolved need for power? And we've seen this across the board with when you have vulnerable people with access to, whether it's the church or gymnasts, in the case of Larry Nassar. When you're creating a pool of vulnerable people and you're giving people a lot of power, it's really important to vet who it is in the room with them. So we would suggest that it's important to not have medicalization be the only route of access, and to be very slow and intentional and include a lot of oversight and training, and not rush to the end point because we think that's going to change the world and fix things quickly.
Yeah. Oh, excuse me. And
no, I was going to say that if you don't medicalize it, wouldn't it move forward more as an aspect of the kind of world?
Okay, so first of all, I would say, like, the question was, if we don't medicalize it, wouldn't that move things more towards a direction that we're trying to avoid?
Have access to power over others.
Having access to power over others. Okay, so I mean, power dynamics exist, and much of what we put together on the table here is actually describing dynamics that are in play. In many ways, we're doing the best that we can to, yes, we have, political positions and things that we're quite open about in terms of positions of how we would like things to go in psychedelic psychedelic renaissance and resurgence. But in this paper, we're describing what we see, right? With regard to this idea that there is only the pathway that is gatekept by medical authorities or church authorities. Both of those are hierarchical organizations with very specific barriers to entry. Personally, I believe that the mystical experience is a deeply human experience that should be available to anyone who seeks it, whether by means of psychedelics or otherwise. And I'm quite skeptical of those who seem to be positioning themselves as gatekeepers and perhaps also for profit. In the United States, we have a for-profit medical system, and I would not be able to afford psychedelic therapy if this was available today. I am an uninsured contingent academic. So in some ways, we're talking about things that affect us personally and people that we know who are vulnerable. I would also point out that, like, with regard to PTSD and the argument for medicalization, the treatment of trauma, that particular syndrome is not equally distributed. It's much higher in prevalence with women and with marginalized communities and racialized communities. And so if your goal is to treat that, that should inform your approach.
And one other point along those lines is at Symposia, we are firm believers in decriminalization. We don't think that people should be arrested for using drugs, but along with decriminalization, we advocate for what we refer to as ideological harm reduction. And there are ways to help educate communities about, for example, dark triad personality types, like what are the red flags to look out for? Because oftentimes people, like with Harvey Weinstein, who had a lot of sexual abuse around Hollywood, a lot of people after that came out said, we didn't know he was sexually abusing people, but we knew he was a bully. Mm-hmm. And it's the same willingness to trespass boundaries that extends into a willingness to sexually abuse. And our culture right now is very tolerant of bullies and allows bullies to rise to the top and have positions of power. So along with democratizing access, we need to democratize access to information about community safety. And also, I would argue, giving people the opportunity to have psychedelic experiences with people they love and who love them and have a relationship with them, and building relationships through these types of experiences will allow for, certain kinds of closeness and understanding that when
an
you're
experience to build within communities,
and even towards building solidarity with communities. So there's certain kinds of problems with medicalization traveling far away to trip with a stranger who you don't know, who maybe got to their position as a guide because they were really good at winding their way up a power hierarchy based on bullying or whatever else, that there are other ways of building resilient communities that should go along with access.
To that, I would point to an old motto within anti-fascist organizing groups, and that is, we keep us safe. And so building that local knowledge and ability to act from a place of care and mutual aid and development, that's something we would advocate for.
And one last point, that speaks to as well some of the work that we do with symposia, where we do occasionally name names when there are bad actors. And the reason that we do that is to give people the information they need to make consensual choices around engaging with problematic actors. You had a question?
Yeah, so going back to sort of the strongman argument that you were refuting, that the man on the street is not as qualified to wield a scalpel as a surgeon, and the way that we assess that is through evidence-based outcomes assessment, right? And so in a world where we have medicalization access, you're describing this as a hierarchy, right? That's presumably built on evidence-based access. That's one thing. If you have a parallel world where we also have access outside of the medical context, what would you suggest as evidence-based criteria for the community to access outside of that hierarchy? Like if we agree that evenance-based metrics are beneficial in general, feel free to.
I think I have a simple answer. Yeah. So I think the question is relating to if we have medical access and community access, what criteria do we have to ensure that people have evidence-based protocols in both spaces? Okay, so first of all, Neşe, Dr. Devenot, and I are both educators in psychedelic studies, and we advocate for science and evidence-based curriculum around drug education, starting when people use drugs, which is pretty early. So that is one way of addressing things at the community level. In some ways, we could compare this to education around sex, much of which, by the way, was led by marginalized and queer communities. In terms of like the distrust of how communities might manage psychedelics, some of which is well founded, and we can point to examples of that not being healthy and things going wrong. With regard to psychedelic medicalization, this is not the first time that medical authority has been applied to use psychedelics to change people's consciousness. And in fact, it will be multiple decades, hopefully, of good healing work on behalf of physicians using psychedelics as medicines to hopefully atone for some of the things that were done during the MKUltra era.
So I guess my first point was that there's also a lot of harm reduction literature that can be drawn from places like Amsterdam, Netherlands, and from Uruguay in developing criteria that are going to sort of operationalize or decriminalize space and also medicalize space. So I think that finding those data points probably wouldn't be terribly difficult. My thought, though, is sort of pivoting a little bit, and I wonder if you could share some ideas around psychedelic studies, what your vision for psychedelic studies as a field is. One thing that we have thought lots about here is the value of transdisciplinarity, and as opposed to interdisciplinarity. So what actually grows out of these fields and different scholars working together to create new ideas. And so I'm just, if you could maybe just share a little bit about how psychedelic studies fits in.
Yeah, so the question was about how to develop psychedelic studies as a field in a way that is truly transdisciplinary and brings different disciplinary insights together rather than keeping disciplines siloed. If that's
how to operationalize that.
Yeah.
And also, what is it, to incorporate data points from international models where psychedelics have either been decriminalized or not fully criminalized.
Just to the earlier
yeah.
You know, I was talking to Cody earlier today about some recent research that I've been involved with Johns Hopkins, where I, as a comparative literature PhD, was working with a student of mine, a bioethics student, and now an anthropology PhD, and another anthropologist, to analyze Johns Hopkins's the narrative reports that were generated out of their first smoking cessation study, and we cross-correlated the experiences with the materials, the study protocol, and we discovered that there were parallels in the ways that people were describing their experiences based on the unpublished and mostly unseen study protocols, and brought them into conversation. So what we were discussing earlier today is I would love to see a expansion of the kinds of research that is done, because you could have, you know, the standard pharmacology research or psychiatry research that's focused on quantitative outcomes, but then you bring in disciplines like history and anthropology, gender studies, looking at power relationships, and you're analyzing what is the package, including the art in the room, including the expectancies generated by, and this relates to Muthu Kumaraswamy et al.'s work, really advocating for bringing this material more into the open. Because once you start creating a new publishing paradigm where we're not just trying to publish data to get over the finish line as quick as possible, but we're showing how we're getting that data and providing the context to meaningfully interpret that data, suddenly we can ask questions about what are we telling people ahead of time? What are their expectations going into it? How much is their experience tied to the way that we're creating their and crafting their set and setting? So as soon as there's been this call to turn towards set and setting, suddenly you need the expertise of people in other disciplines, in the humanities, the social sciences, in a way that can only happen once we get to a place where those disciplines are respected as much as the sciences. Because I have been working in this field since 2010, and I am half Indigenous, and I have been doing this work for a long time in a lot of different ways. And the reason why I'm not more widely known is because I have dealt with the kinds of personality types that have not liked my work and have sought to marginalize me. And I'm using this not to paint myself as some kind of victim, but just to, I think it's a case study in how the bullying dynamics that are tolerated in this field are holding the field back, and how we need to respect the humanities and other disciplines in order to actually gain the expertise in a meaningful way and advance the narratives that we're using to talk about psychedelics.
The one thing I have to add to that excellent answer to your question is that I teach Dr. Devenot's essay, A Declaration of Psychedelic Studies, that she wrote 12 years ago, as the very first thing that my students in my psychedelic studies class teaches. And she has a lot to contribute to this field, and has already contributed a lot to this field.
And just to emphasize, it's really not about me. I just cite my example because it's very apparent to me, but this happens across the board. And there are brilliant people who are not here and who are not talking with us and having these conversations today because they have been forced out and made to feel unwelcome here and underappreciated. So we need to get past the hierarchies of academia to be able to respect all career levels and all disciplines in order to get to the field that I think will ultimately be the more exciting research is yet to come. Thank you for